February 25th, 2026. That is today. And what you are about to hear is not a rumor, not a theory, and not something pulled from a gossip column. This is the account of a man who stood 12 feet from Sean Combs every single night, in a corridor so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat, in a facility that does not appear on any public transfer registry. A man who watched things through a reinforced window that he cannot explain. A man who found things hidden inside walls that should have been empty. A man who was warned, threatened, and eventually driven out of his own city because of what he refused to stop looking at. He is not speaking publicly. He is not on camera. But the account exists. It is documented, while the headlines focused on the courtroom. Because here is the thing about Sean Combs that the press conferences and the legal filings and the carefully managed public narrative have never captured. There is a version of this story that exists beneath the official version, a version that lives in unmarked documents, in camera footage that glitches at the same hour every single night, in symbols found folded inside a mattress, in an underground room with chains bolted to the floor, in a surveillance system that nobody on the official staff roster had ever been briefed about. That version of the story is what one ordinary corrections officer stumbled into. And today, on February 25th, 2026, just as the legal proceedings surrounding Combs continue to evolve in ways that are shaking institutions most people thought were untouchable, that account gets told in full. Before we go any deeper, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story like this one. Now let us get back to it. Working corrections was never glamorous. Nobody walks into that career chasing excitement. You walk in because it is steady, because the hours are consistent, because the structure of the job gives your life a predictability that feels like solid ground in a world that offers very little of it. Clock in, walk the halls, monitor the inmates, clock out, go home. That was the rhythm this man had built his life around for years. The prison walls did not just hold the inmates inside. They held the chaos of everything else out, and he had made his peace with ordinary. More than made his peace with it, he had built a home inside of ordinary, and he was not looking for a reason to leave. Then one morning he walked into the break room and found a memo pinned to the bulletin board. One sheet of paper, standard government letterhead, and a name printed on it that made everything in the room go briefly strange. Sean Combs, known to the world as Diddy, being transferred to their facility, effective end of week. He read it twice, then a third time. Because men like Diddy did not end up in mid-level state facilities, and everyone in that room knew it. They had lawyers who made calls before paperwork ever got printed. They had resources that redirected outcomes before outcomes had a chance to form. But they had a kind of influence that did not disappear simply because charges had been filed. And yet there was his name, stamped and signed, as official and irrefutable as anything that had ever been posted on that board. By the time the rest of the shift came in, the break room was already running loud with speculation. Tax issues, sealed indictments, business disputes, a deal made with someone higher up the chain to control the environment of the incarceration. Nobody had real answers. The chatter circled the same vague possibilities over and over, and beneath all of it was a current that nobody was naming directly. The feeling that whatever had brought this particular man to this particular facility, the explanation was not going to be the obvious one. That afternoon, the warden called a mandatory meeting. And the tone of it ended whatever casual speculation had been building. He was the kind of man who could silence a room without raising his voice, and when he stood at the front and waited for the last murmur to die, what followed was clipped, precise, and entirely without warmth. Sean Combs was arriving by end of week. He had been assigned to their facility for security reasons. That was not up for discussion. Their job was protocol, their job was silence, and any breach of confidentiality would be met with immediate termination and possible legal consequences. A hand went up from the back of the room asking why here, why not a federal facility, why this arrangement? The warden's jaw tightened. Classified. Next question. There were no next questions. In the days that followed, the facility transformed in ways that felt deeply wrong. New cameras appeared in corridors that already had adequate coverage. Updated access protocols landed on every desk. Confidentiality agreements were signed in triplicate. The warden pulled a small group of senior guards aside individually and delivered the same message each time in slightly different language. Watch. Be quiet. Do not ask what you are not meant to know. That phrase was the one that stuck. Not meant to know. As if there was something to know. As if the knowing itself was the dangerous part, not the doing or the seeing, just the knowing. When the day of arrival came, the air inside the prison was different in a way that was felt before it was understood. New inmates arrived the same way without exception. Shackled, eyes down or darting sideways, shoulders drawn inward, with the full weight of where they are landing on them visibly and immediately like a physical thing. Not this one. Sean Combs walked through intake in a plain white shirt and gray sweatpants, looking unremarkable and completely in command at the same moment. His posture was straight, his head was level, and his eyes moved through the room the way a man's eyes move when he is assessing territory he intends to understand. When the guard at the intake desk said his name and offered the standard welcome, Combs gave a small, quiet smile, almost amused. "I will make the best of it," he said, smooth and collected, like a man acknowledging a minor inconvenience rather than the beginning of an incarceration. He answered every question during processing with the cooperative ease of someone who had decided that this particular performance cost him nothing. He submitted to searches without resistance, made a comment that made one of the younger guards laugh, and moved through the intake procedure with a composure that should have been impossible and somehow wasn't. But there was something underneath all of it that sat wrong. Not his manner, not any specific thing he did or said. It was the way he looked at the cameras. Not with defiance, not with anxiety, not with the defeated resignation of someone newly imprisoned. He looked at them the way a man looks at equipment he already controls. Aware of them, unbothered by them, yet almost indifferent to what they were recording because the recording was not a threat to him in any way he needed to concern himself with. After processing, he was escorted to the isolated wing at the far end of the building. That wing was normally reserved for inmates who required extraordinary levels of protection or who posed a documented risk to others in general population. His placement there came with no paperwork explaining why, and no briefing beyond what the warden had already delivered. As the guard walked past the cell that first evening and glanced through the reinforced window, Combs was sitting on the edge of the cot with his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead at nothing. He did not look up, but the air around him felt charged in a way that was genuinely difficult to describe later. Like the specific static quality of air before lightning, like something building that had not yet found its ground. "Keep moving," another guard muttered, nudging him forward. "Do not linger." That night, lying awake staring at the ceiling of his own home, the guard could not locate the precise source of what he was feeling. It was not fear, not yet. It was the specific unease of someone who has walked into a situation that has been arranged and knows it has been arranged, but cannot yet see the full shape of the arrangement. He had more questions than answers, and something in the back of his mind, something older and quieter than conscious thought, was already telling him that those answers were going to cost something to find. His first actual shift guarding that cell felt like stepping through a membrane into a different set of rules about what was normal. The high-security wing was silent in a way the rest of the facility never was. Prisons are acoustically dense places, constantly saturated with the layered sounds of hundreds of lives compressed into close proximity, metal on metal, distant voices, footsteps on concrete, the perpetual low hum of institutional life. This wing had none of that, just the buzz of fluorescent lights, the echo of his own boots on the polished floor, and the sense that the silence itself was somehow inhabited. Getting to the cell required 3 separate checkpoints, each manned by guards whose faces had the same closed, careful expression and who said nothing as he passed. The corridor leading to that final cell felt longer on foot than its actual length warranted. When he reached his station, he could see clearly through the reinforced window. Combs was pacing. Not the restless, anxious pacing of a man who cannot settle. Deliberate, rhythmic, almost meditative, like someone working through a complex problem by moving through physical space. Occasionally, he would pause and turn toward the camera with an expression that was not hostile, not performative, but almost collegial. Acknowledging the audience, confirming the performance was understood to be underway. His lips moved sometimes while he paced. Silent words. The guard watched him for long stretches and tried to assign an explanation. Prayer, maybe, or music running through memory. Something to pass the long institutional hours. But the intensity in his expression did not fit those explanations. His eyes moved around the interior of the cell as though following something that had no visible form, as though the room contained more than furniture and concrete. Around midnight, the guard did a standard patrol, and when he reached the cell window and looked through, Combs was sitting on the edge of the cot now, elbows on knees, hands clasped, gaze fixed on the far wall. Then, without any change in posture, without any visible trigger, he turned his head and looked directly through the glass with a smile that created distance rather than closing it. "Everything okay in there?" the guard asked, keeping his voice flat. "Oh, it is fine," Combs said, tone easy, almost bored, just getting settled in. The guard nodded and started to move on. Then the voice came again behind him, unhurried and low. "You hear it yet?" He turned back. "Hear what?" A soft, quiet chuckle, and nothing else. He walked away. He told himself it was psychological maneuvering, a celebrity inmate establishing dominance with the new guard, standard behavior from someone who had spent decades controlling every room he entered. He went back to his station. He checked the monitors. He logged the time. But his pulse was doing something it had no cause to do in an empty corridor with no active threat present. Then the sound started. It was barely there at first, a low hum sitting just beneath the steady electric buzz of the overhead lights. He scanned the monitors. Nothing. Empty corridor, still cell, everything exactly where it was supposed to be. But the hum grew slowly and almost imperceptibly. It was changing texture as it grew, becoming something more complex, more human, something that carried the rhythm and cadence of voices without ever quite resolving into words. Like a conversation happening at the absolute limit of perception, syllables dissolving before they could be assembled into meaning. He walked back to the cell. Combs was already at the window, face close to the glass, eyes gleaming under the harsh light. "You hear it now, don't you?" he said softly. The guard's grip tightened on his flashlight. "What is it?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Combs tilted his head, studying him with the patient calm of someone who already knows every answer the other person is going to reach for. "You will see soon enough," he said, "but not tonight. Back at the station, cameras showing nothing, corridors still, all monitors unchanged. The sound continued for another hour, faint and persistent, like an itch with no location. By the time his shift ended, he felt like he was carrying something out of that wing that had not been on him when he came in. Not a physical weight, something else. The specific unease of a man who has crossed a threshold without quite realizing when the crossing happened. By the second shift, the strangeness had stopped being atmospheric and started being concrete. Around dinner time, a food cart rolled into the high security wing, pushed by a man in a spotless chef's uniform, who clearly had no connection to the facility's institutional kitchen. The smell preceded everything else. Roasting chicken, fresh herbs, something rich and warm that had no business existing in this building. The cart went directly to Combs' cell. A senior officer the guard had never spoken to accompanied the chef inside and emerged 10 minutes later without a word or a glance in the guard's direction. When the door closed, Combs settled back on his cot with the satisfied expression of a man who had ordered exactly what he wanted and received exactly that. Over the days that followed, the deliveries kept coming. Designer clothes in discreet garment bags, expensive headphones in unmarked packaging, a leather journal with gold-embossed initials on the cover. Everything moved through the wing quickly and quietly by staff members who performed their deliveries with the efficiency of people who had been specifically instructed to complete the task without inviting discussion. Nobody logged it. Nobody acknowledged it in any official capacity. If you brought it up, but you received a non-answer from anyone senior enough to have arranged it. But the deliveries were not even the most disorienting element of what was happening. The visitors were. Late at night, after the facility had reduced to its minimum overnight activity, figures began appearing in the high-security wing who had no documented reason to be there. Men in expensive suits, women in clothes that belonged in a different kind of building entirely, and on at least two occasions, someone whose face carried the faint familiarity of a person seen regularly on screens or magazine covers, though never close enough or clearly enough lit for certainty. They were never logged into the system. Their visits left no trail in any official record. They stayed for periods ranging from 20 minutes to well over an hour, and when they left, Ian Combs' demeanor in his cell afterward was always the same: settled, satisfied, like a man who had just received a favorable update from people he trusted. He went to the warden after a particularly blatant unlogged delivery, a case of imported wine that arrived under the paperwork of electronic equipment. He kept it professional: irregularities in documentation, proper channels. The warden did not look up from his desk for the first several seconds, and when he did, his expression carried none of the collegial neutrality of their usual exchanges. "That is above your pay grade," he said. "Keep the peace and do your job." "Above my pay grade," the guard repeated, because he could not stop himself. "We are running a prison, not a five-star hotel." The warden's eyes came up then, flat and unyielding. "Exactly," he said. "Well, so stick to what you are paid for and leave the rest to me." He walked out of that office feeling used in a way that was new to him on this job. Something was wrong with all of it, not just procedurally wrong, wrong in the way that certain situations are wrong before you can articulate the specific mechanics of the wrongness, felt in the chest and the gut before the mind catches up with language for it. Then came the camera glitches. Part of his assigned duties involved reviewing security footage from the block at regular intervals. For the first several days, everything appeared completely routine. Long stretches of institutional stillness, Combs pacing or reading or sitting, staff passing through on schedule. But late into the night shift, always at the same two windows of time, once around 1 in the morning and once close to 3, yes, the feed would begin to degrade. Not random noise. Something more targeted and specific. The image would warp and twist and then snap back to normal. And every single time the picture returned, Combs would be in a different position than he had occupied before the glitch. Different side of the cell, different posture, sometimes even different clothing. Like the gap in footage was not a technical malfunction, but a curtain drawn at specific moments for specific purposes. The tech team gave him the standard explanations: old equipment, signal interference, atmospheric conditions. He listened to all of it and believed none of it. The outages were too consistent, too precisely timed, too perfectly correlated with specific activities to be anything other than deliberate. Someone was controlling what those cameras could see and when they could see it, and they had been doing it from the very first night. One evening during an outage, he left his station and walked directly to the cell. The corridor was weighted with a stillness that felt manufactured. When he reached the window, Combs was on his cot staring at the wall. He asked if everything was okay. Combs turned slowly and said, "You checking up on me, officer," with that particular tone of his, light on the surface, something harder underneath it. "Just making sure the equipment is working," the guard replied. Combs smiled faintly and leaned back. "The cameras are not your problem," he said. "They are doing exactly what they are supposed to do." Before the guard could ask who he meant by they, yet the corridor lights flickered and cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. When they steadied, Combs was already lying back on his cot with his eyes closed, as though the entire conversation had been a dream. On the 5th day, with Combs in the courtyard for his supervised hour of outdoor time, the guard made a decision that would alter the next several months of his life. The cell was empty. The wing was quiet. The keycard was in his hand before the conscious part of his mind had fully signed off on the action. He stood at the door and felt the full weight of what crossing that threshold meant. Career ending if caught. Possibly something worse than career ending, depending on how far the reach extended of whoever had arranged the underground machinery of this particular incarceration. He slotted the card. The door opened. The cell was immaculate, military precise in its organization, bed made with institutional corners, floor without a mark, sparse furniture arranged with a deliberateness that felt more like staging than habitation. Nothing unusual at first pass, but he had not come for first passes. He started with the mattress, running his hands along every edge and pressing into every corner until the third corner gave him something. A rigid shape beneath the fabric, a slit in the cover, barely visible unless you were specifically looking for it. Inside, folded tightly, was a piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, not recently introduced. He unfolded it. Strange symbols filled most of the page, intricate and precise, belonging to no alphabet he recognized. Not random marks, deliberate, structured, yet to the kind of notation that carries meaning even when the meaning is inaccessible to the reader. Alongside the symbols, in a different hand, jagged and hurried as though written quickly under pressure, three words: watchers, silence, loyalty. He pocketed it and moved to the walls, fingers along the seams between bricks, pressing and testing. Near the back corner, one brick shifted slightly under sustained pressure. He pried it free. Behind it was a hollow, and inside the hollow was another folded note alongside a crude drawing of an eye surrounded by flames. The note contained a list of names he did not recognize, with dates and locations attached to each one, stretching back years across multiple states and jurisdictions. The handwriting was entirely different from the first note, more controlled, more deliberate. The handwriting of someone keeping a record rather than leaving a message in haste. He was reading it when the footsteps arrived at the door. He spun around. A senior guard stood in the doorway with an expression that was equal parts fury and fear, and the fear was the more revealing of the two. The guard stammered something that was not quite an explanation. The senior guard stepped inside and closed the door with a quiet deliberateness that was more threatening than any slam would have been. He looked at the brick, at the visible edge of the note, and his jaw set hard. "You are digging where you should not be," he said. "That is a mistake. Something is not right here," the guard said, because he could not stop himself from saying it. "You have seen it too. The glitches, the visitors. None of it adds up." For just a moment, something shifted in the senior guard's face. A door opening a single inch before a hand from the other side pushed it firmly shut. Then the expression hardened completely. "Listen to me carefully," he said, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This is not just some celebrity doing time. You do not ask questions about him. You do not go through his cell. You do your own and you go home." He glanced at the camera in the corner, then stepped closer. "You think you are the first guard to start asking these questions? You are not. And do you know what happened to the ones who kept asking? They do not work here anymore." He paused. "They do not work anywhere anymore. Put the brick back," he said simply. "Walk out of here and forget you ever saw anything." The silence between them stretched thick and suffocating. Yes, the senior guard stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Go." The brick went back. The hands doing it were shaking. He left the cell without another word, but the notes were already in his pocket, and some things, once known, cannot be responded to with obedience. Back at the monitor station, reviewing the footage from earlier in the shift, he found the glitches again. The same warped, distorted sequences. But this time, listening closely with headphones pressed tight against his ears, he could make out something inside the static. Faint and distorted, there were voices, human voices, clearly, unmistakably, even if the words themselves kept dissolving before they fully formed. But two words repeated across multiple separate glitch sequences with enough consistency that he could not dismiss them. Watching, silence. The same two words from the note inside the mattress. The same two words from a document hidden behind a loose brick in a cell that had been searched and cleared on intake. The same two words appearing now inside footage that the tech team had repeatedly assured him was the product of faulty equipment and signal interference. The glitches were not malfunctions. They were communications. Scheduled, deliberate, and ongoing. The sixth night was colder than it had any physical reason to be. The kind of cold that registers in the body as something other than temperature. He was beginning his standard rounds when he heard it coming from Combs' cell. Low, rhythmic, barely audible through the reinforced door. He moved closer and looked through the window and found something he was not prepared for. Yet Combs was hanging cross-legged on the floor in the center of the cell, not on the cot, not near the walls, but in the precise geometric center of the floor space. Head bowed, hands resting on his knees. His lips were moving continuously, the sound threading through the door at a volume that seemed calibrated for exactly one listener. And what the guard heard through that glass did not resemble any language he had encountered across years of working in a facility that cycled through dozens of dialects and tongues from across the world. It was guttural, rolling, almost melodic, with the cadence and rhythm of something ritualistic rather than conversational. The flashlight bulb flickered, once, then twice. The shadows on the wall stretched in ways that a flickering light alone could not fully account for. Yet his own breath was visible in the beam. The temperature in that corridor had dropped past any reasonable explanation. He said the name. Combs stopped mid-syllable, and the silence was absolute in a way that felt constructed rather than natural. Then he lifted his head slowly and looked through the window with an expression that contained no surprise, no guilt, no irritation. Just that same calm, that same complete and unnerving awareness. "You should not eavesdrop," he said quietly. "Just doing my job," the guard replied, steady with effort. Combs smiled. "Sure you are." He continued his patrol, pretending to check the empty cells down the hall, and he was still running through everything he had accumulated. The symbols, the names, the underground voices, the unnatural cold, when the sound came that stopped every thought in his head. Why, he stood absolutely still. His body responded before his mind did, the hair on his arms straight up, his throat closing, his feet already moving toward the sound while part of him was still trying to decide if he had actually heard it. The sound came from the far end of the block, from a door he had passed hundreds of times in his career at this facility. Staff only, always locked. He had never given it a second thought. His hand went to the handle. It turned easily. Behind the door was a narrow staircase descending into complete darkness. He went down. The stairs were steep and cold, and the air at the bottom was thick and stale in the way of spaces that had been sealed from regular circulation for a very long time. His flashlight threw jittery beams across damp concrete walls as the staircase opened into a large, dimly lit room. The first things he saw were the restraints. Iron chains, old but solid, bolted directly into the wall and into the floor at multiple anchor points. He stood in front of them for a moment and did not allow himself to think too specifically about their purpose. Against the far wall was a row of active monitors, humming softly in the half-dark, each screen showing a different section of the prison above. This was not any surveillance system he had ever been trained on or briefed about. The cameras these monitors drew from were focused on specific, targeted locations: the high-security wing, certain visitor corridors, a section of the administrative offices. It was a private surveillance infrastructure running beneath and parallel to the official one, invisible to anyone who was not meant to know it existed. Beside the monitors was a stack of documents. His hands were shaking as he went through them. Names and dates and locations, a significant number matching what he had found in the notes in the cell, financial records, wire transfer receipts involving numbers that were very large and entirely uncontextualized, contracts without identifying headers or official stamps, what appeared to be detailed dossiers on private individuals. And at the top of one particular stack, a file labeled with Combs' name in plain block letters. He opened it. The contents were heavily redacted throughout, but the portions left visible were enough to paint a picture that made his hands shake harder. References to something called special projects, written without any elaboration that remained unblocked. References to high-level cooperation. He had references to containment measures, references to an arrangement that predated the incarceration and that the unredacted language made clear was designed to extend well beyond it. "What the hell is this?" he whispered to the empty room. A sound behind him. He spun. Nothing. But the air had changed in a way that was now familiar. That specific thickening, that pressurized quality that had no physical explanation. He did not wait. He grabbed every document his pockets could hold, moved back up the stairs as fast as he could without losing footing, and came through the door into the corridor above. The door slammed behind him. He walked back to his station. He sat down. He tried to breathe. The next morning, he was summoned to the warden's office and found Combs already seated there in a visitor's chair across from the desk. Yeah, composed and calm, with something different and considerably colder moving through his eyes when the guard came through the door. "Morning," Combs said pleasantly. "Sleep well?" The warden cleared his throat. "Mr. Combs has raised some concerns about your conduct during last night's shift." Combs leaned forward slightly, holding the guard's gaze. "Careful where you wander," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You might stumble into something you cannot handle." It was not framed as a warning. The absolute certainty behind the words made that clear. It was a statement of fact delivered by a man who had no doubt about the accuracy of what he was saying. The second meeting with the warden was worse because it dropped the pretense of professional concern entirely. "There are people watching this facility," the warden said, the voice carrying the flat calm of someone delivering a message he did not author. "Powerful people, people who will not tolerate disruptions. If you want to keep your job, if you want to keep your life in dad, you will drop this." The guard nodded slowly. He had learned across the past week and a half that nodding was the correct response when the walls themselves were listening. Back on the block, passing the cell, Combs looked up from his bunk with a smirk already in place. "Rough day?" he asked, mock sympathy dripping from every syllable. The guard kept walking. "Careful now," Combs called after him. "You would not want to make the wrong enemy." He stopped. He turned back and looked through the window. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. Combs set his book aside and stood and moved close to the door. "What I want does not matter," he said. "What matters is what you want. Do you want your quiet life, or do you want to dig yourself a grave you will not get up from?" The guard said nothing. Combs held his gaze for a long moment. "There is a game being played here," he said softly, "and you are a pawn. Pawns do not last long when they start believing they are something else." Then he stepped back into the shadow of his cell, and the conversation was over. That same week, the pressure followed him home for the first time. A car parked on his street with windows tinted too dark to see through, present when he arrived, present when he left. Anonymous calls to his phone, brief, silent, no voice, ended before he could respond. He told himself it was stress, perception warped by accumulated strangeness. But the car was there 3 consecutive days. The calls came at the same hour each night. This was not coincidence, and he had stopped being the kind of person who needed coincidence to be confirmed before taking it seriously. He started documenting everything. Every glitch logged by precise timestamp. Every unlogged visitor described in as much detail as he could capture. The warden's exact words from both meetings. Combs' exact words from every significant exchange. The contents of both hidden notes. A detailed written account of the underground room, the chains, the monitors, the documents, the specific language that had survived the redactions. He pulled a few seconds of the distorted footage to a personal drive during a quiet moment in the monitor room, capturing the voices in the static and the shapes that moved through the warped image. Then the envelope appeared on his doorstep one evening. Unmarked, no return address, no postage. He opened it at his kitchen table, surrounded by everything he had gathered. Inside was a single sheet of white paper. One word, printed in large block letters, the kind of font chosen specifically to be impossible to misread or interpret generously. "Stop." He stared at it for a long time. They knew where he lived. They knew what he was doing. They wanted him to know they were watching him with the same precision he had been watching the cell on the monitor. And sitting there in the yellow light of his kitchen, with his hands flat on the table and his heart doing something irregular in his chest, he thought about what Combs had said. "There is a game being played here, and you are a pawn." And he thought about the other half of that equation. Yet the part Combs had not said out loud because he had not needed to. Pawns can still move. Pawns can still change the outcome if they move at exactly the right moment. He resigned 2 days later. "Personal reasons," the paperwork said. The warden did not ask for clarification. His expression said he had been expecting it and was quietly relieved. On the final shift, walking the block one last time, going through the motions of a job that was ending, he passed the cell, and Combs looked up from his book as though the timing had been arranged. "I think you are free now," Combs said, voice low and even. "But you are just like the rest of them. No malice, no anger, Just that unnerving, bottomless certainty. The guard did not respond. He walked the full length of the corridor without looking back and passed through every checkpoint and out into the pale early light for the last time. That night, alone at his kitchen table with everything he had collected spread across the surface, he opened his laptop. He had spent weeks researching how to move information securely, how to leave no traceable path between himself and the destination. He used a VPN, an encrypted connection, a pseudonymous identity. He uploaded all of it, the footage with the voices in the static, the photographs of the documents from the underground room, detailed accounts of every conversation, every anomaly, every piece of the hidden architecture he had been allowed to see. He wrote a cover message under a name that was not his own and addressed it to a journalist whose published work on institutional corruption he had spent weeks reading and verifying before choosing her name as the destination. He clicked send. The relief was physical and immediate, a pressure releasing from somewhere in his chest that had been building for weeks. And beneath it, colder and steadier, the understanding that this was not an ending. It was a transfer of weight. What he had been carrying had moved now into the world, beyond his control, and the forces that had been watching him inside those walls were going to notice the absence. He moved within a week. Different state, different city, a small, quiet town where people tended to their own affairs and did not ask questions about newcomers. He found a house on a residential street and tried to establish a new rhythm. But fear does not relocate with you. It arrives at the new address before you do. At night, he sat at the window and watched the street. Every unfamiliar car that sat too long felt like a confirmation of something. Every knock at the door arrived in his chest a half second before it arrived at the door. He slept in short intervals and woke to sounds that resolved into nothing. 3 weeks after the resignation, on one of those sleepless nights, he saw it. A car parked directly across the street, windows fully blacked out, engine off, just sitting there in the dark at 2 in the morning with no person visible and no reason to be there. He watched it for what felt like an hour. It did not move. Nobody got out. It simply sat there, silent and still. What in the way of something that wants to be seen without wanting to be confronted? He backed away from the window with his hands shaking and thought about the email he had sent. The footage, the documents, the names and dates and locations stretching across years and jurisdictions, the account of a room beneath a prison that had chains bolted into the floor and cameras watching sections of the building that the official surveillance system did not cover. All of it out there now in the hands of someone he had chosen carefully and had to trust because trust was the only instrument left available to him. And this is where we are today, on a February 25th, 2026, as the case of Sean Combs continues to move through legal proceedings that have already implicated institutions most people believed were beyond implication. When the public version of this story is being told in courtrooms and press releases and managed media appearances. But there is another version, and it lives in the kind of places that public versions are specifically designed to prevent anyone from looking. It lives in the documents of a man who guarded a cell and refused to look away when the looking became dangerous. It lives in footage where voices say the same words as notes hidden in a mattress. It lives in an underground room with a private surveillance system and iron chains that belong to no official record anyone has ever been permitted to access. One ordinary man saw a portion of that infrastructure from the inside, and what he saw was enough to make him walk away from a career, leave a city, and spend his nights watching a dark street from a dark window, wondering whether the truth he moved into the world has found the hands that have the courage and the power to carry it somewhere it cannot be buried. Maybe it has. Maybe it already has. The empire does not always fall in a single visible moment. Sometimes it cracks slowly, in the dark, one document at a time, one account at a time, one guard at a time, who decided that ordinary was no longer something he was willing to be. Whatever happens next, something changed the night that email was sent. Something shifted when those documents left a room that was never supposed to be found and entered a world that was never supposed to know it existed. The man in that cell with his books and his calm and that knowing smile that creates distance instead of closing it may understand the implications of that shift better than anyone else alive. And maybe on some level, that is exactly what he is most afraid of.